Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when a photo of something you'd forgotten or something you'd hoped to leave in the past suddenly resurfaces and turns your whole world upside down? That's exactly what happened in a story that has kept people guessing for years. It all starts back in 1985. A young couple, madly in love and just starting their life together, vanished without a trace after their wedding day. Everyone thought they'd run away. Everyone thought it was a simple case of two people choosing a new future somewhere else. But 12 years later, a satellite photo revealed something hidden deep in the Florida wilderness, something that made everyone realize we hadn't gotten the whole story. Picture this. It's a warm Florida afternoon in June of 1985. The flowers are blooming, the air is filled with the rich scent of orange trees, and a young couple is tying the knot in a small church surrounded by their closest friends and family. Melissa, a charming 24-year-old woman with big hopes and a loving heart, walked down the aisle in a simple white dress. She was nervous, excited, and full of plans for a future with her new husband, Brandon. Everyone who was there that day said the two were deeply in love, not just a young love, but something real, something you hoped would last a lifetime. Brandon came from a wealthy family. His father, Gregory Whitmore, was a powerful man in the community, a successful developer who seemed to have everything under control. But there were rumors that Gregory hadn't approved of the marriage. He believed Melissa, a woman from a poor neighborhood who hadn't gone to college, was not the right match for his son. There were arguments, icy exchanges, and a feeling of unhappiness beneath the surface. Nevertheless, the couple walked forward, ignoring doubts and negativity, and made their promises to each other in a small church ceremony. Their marriage seemed to be a fresh start. They were excited to move into their first home together and pursue their future side by side. But then something strange happened. The couple vanished without a trace. The last people who saw them said they were driving off in their yellow Thunderbird, ready to celebrate their marriage and their future. But after that moment, they were gone, just gone, without a phone call, without a note, without a single piece of information about where they'd gone or what had become of them. The police investigated. The community was divided. Some believed the couple simply chose to disappear, to cut ties with their past and start a new life somewhere else. Others insisted something terrible must have happened. There were rumors of foul play, of disputes within the family, of motives hidden in the rich man's empire, but without a car, without a body, without hard evidence. The case went cold. As years passed, the trail seemed to grow icy. The phone calls from journalists and investigators dwindled. The posters that had gone up around town were taken down. The file was closed. Everyone seemed ready to move on, except for a few people who hadn't given up. Among them were Linda, Melissa's mother, and a small group of journalists and students who remained obsessed with the disappearance. They kept asking questions, kept searching, kept wondering what had really happened that day in 1985. Then something bizarre and dramatic turned everything upside down. 12 years later, in 1997, a group of University of Miami students were analyzing satellite images of the Florida Everglades. They were trying to track land, transformation, and vegetation patterns, not solve a missing persons case. But when they zoomed in on a particular spot, something unusual appeared. There it was, a yellow shape, barely visible underwater, resting deep in the swamp. At first it seemed impossible. Could it be a car, a vehicle that had gone undetected for years, hidden in a place nobody thought to search? As soon as the students alerted the authorities, the police rushed to the scene. They called in divers, specialized equipment, and a recovery team. The water was deep, filled with thick vegetation and mud. It made retrieving the vehicle a delicate and challenging process. But when the team raised it from the swamp and placed it on a flatbed, there was no doubt it was a yellow Thunderbird. The same yellow Thunderbird that a young couple drove away in on their wedding day in 1985. Suddenly, a case that seemed closed was opened once again. The recovery raised countless questions. Why was the car here, hidden in the swamp, 12 years later? Where were the couple, the two people who were supposed to be in it? Was it an accident, a tragedy that nobody knew about, or was there something more sinister at play? The story quickly made headlines and captured the imagination of people across the country. Everyone wanted to know the truth. Was this a simple disappearance, a young couple tragically veering off the road into water and sinking without a chance to call for help? Or was there a darker side to this story, a conspiracy, a hidden crime, something more sinister that someone, somewhere, had kept buried all these years? As the authorities investigated and the search intensified, many people came forward with rumors, suspects, and wild stories. Some said the young couple hadn't gotten into the water by accident at all. Some insisted there were powerful people who hadn't wanted them to be together, people who stood to lose a great deal if the marriage went forward. Whatever the truth might be, it seemed more and more clear that the yellow Thunderbird was a key piece of the puzzle. A silent witness to whatever really happened all those years ago. The discovery opened up a labyrinth of questions. Who put the car there? Why were the couple not in it when it was recovered? Why hadn't anyone noticed it in all those years? Not a ranger, not a boater, not a search team. As we follow this story, We will uncover hidden messages, strange motives, and suspects we hadn't suspected were involved. The trail will lead us back to a family divided by love, power, and reputation, and forward into a conspiracy that might be much more sinister than anyone first believed. So stay with us, because in the chapters to come, we're going to piece together a puzzle that has remained unsolved for 12 years. The answers are there, hidden just beneath the surface, and we're about to bring them into the light. As the recovery team carefully lifted the yellow Thunderbird from the water, a small crowd started to gather on the nearby trail, trying to get a view of what was going on. Among them were journalists, park rangers, and a few locals who remembered the story all too well. There were whispered conversations, nervous glances, and a feeling that something big was about to come to light, something that hadn't been meant to stay hidden. Detective Prom, a veteran officer who'd kept the couple's file on his desk all these years, stood near the scene, quietly observing the recovery. His face was a mixture of hope and disbelief. He'd investigated this case back in 1985, when the trail first went cold. He'd interviewed the Whitmore family, Melissa's friends, and nearly everyone who'd come into their lives in those final days. But all his hard work seemed to lead into a wall made of silence, suspicion, and power. Prom hadn't forgotten the strange details, the rumors that circulated about a conflict within the Whitmore family, the threatening phone calls Melissa received a few days before the wedding, and the reports from neighbors who said a dark sedan was frequently parked near her home in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. There were many questions that seemed to lead back to the rich, powerful family that Brandon belonged to. Was it a coincidence, or was there something more sinister tying them to what happened? As the car was carefully winched up from the swamp, a few small items fell from it: a license plate frame, a piece of a side mirror, adding to the physical puzzle that investigators were trying to piece back together. The recovery team placed a protective covering over the vehicle and transported it to a nearby storage facility. There, under careful supervision, the car would be examined in detail. Forensic experts would search for traces: a hair, a fiber, a fingerprint, anything that might connect it to suspects or clarify what really happened that day. Meanwhile, the media was filled with stories about the recovery. Reporters interviewed locals who insisted something strange had gone on in the Whitmore family in the days and months leading up to the disappearance. Some remembered a heated phone call between Gregory and his son just days before the wedding. Others said they'd noticed a man in a dark sedan following Melissa and Brandon around town. There were rumors about messages left on their phone, threatening messages that seemed meant to intimidate, to control their choices. The rich and powerful were not always what they seemed, and this recovery seemed to be proving that in dramatic fashion. For Linda, this was a moment filled with hope and fear in equal measure. Hope that she might find answers about what happened to her only child, and fear that those answers might be more painful than not knowing. She hadn't gotten much rest in the days following the recovery. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw the yellow Thunderbird resting at the bottom of the swamp, and she felt her own pulse quickening. Where were Melissa and Brandon? Why hadn't their bodies been in the car when it was raised from the water? Detective Prom called Linda in and explained what the forensics team had started to uncover. There were no human remains in the car, which meant the couple hadn't died there, at least not immediately. There were traces of sand and clay on the seats and carpets, suggesting the car may have been driven off-road at some point and then deliberately pushed into the swamp. There were also small amounts of blood, not enough to be fatal, but enough to suggest some kind of struggle. It seemed someone had gotten injured in or near the vehicle. This revelation opened up a whole new set of questions. If the couple hadn't died in the car, then where were they taken afterwards? Who was injured, and how much danger were they in by the time the car was abandoned in the swamp? Detective Pram tried to piece these clues together. His team canvassed the area, looking for any hidden trails or back roads that might connect the main highway to the spot where the car was recovered. They interviewed park rangers, locals who lived nearby, and anyone who might have noticed something strange in the days following the disappearance. Few people remembered much. It was a wild, overgrown area even back then, and it seemed a perfect place to dispose of a car without drawing suspicion. Meanwhile, a separate team investigated phone and financial records from 1985. They were trying to piece together the movements of everyone involved, not just the couple, but their friends, family, and anyone else who may have crossed their path in those final days. There were phone calls made from payphones near the park in the days after the disappearance. There were transactions made with a credit card that belonged to the Whitmore family. There were numerous messages left on a phone that seemed to warn someone to stay away, messages that were never investigated in depth at the time. As all these details fell into place, a picture started to emerge. Not a clear picture, not a complete story, but a puzzle with key pieces missing. It seemed something dramatic and dangerous had unfolded in the days following the couple's disappearance, something that powerful people may have tried to keep hidden. Detective Prom decided it was time to question those who might know more. The suspects were already in police custody: Otis Dunhall, the young man who'd gotten close to the couple at Gregory's direction, and Gregory himself, a rich and powerful person who seemed to be at the center of it all. The question now was whether either of them would break their silence. Otis seemed nervous and unsure, a weak link in the conspiracy. If pressed, would he reveal what really happened? Meanwhile, Linda remained a key person in this story, not a suspect, but a mother who'd fought against silence and suspicion. For years, whatever the conspiracy was, whatever the suspects were hiding, Linda was not going to let it stay hidden much longer. She insisted on staying involved in the investigations, demanded to be kept informed, and made sure the authorities that kept this from being swept under the rug, whatever the rich and powerful might want. This was her quest for the truth, a quest made more dramatic and painful by the years of not knowing. As the forensics team finished their first reports and the detectives prepared their questions, the conspiracy that had remained buried for more than a dozen years was about to come into view. Whatever the suspects were trying to conceal, whatever motives drove them, the truth was close enough now that everyone involved could feel it. And when it came, it would shock not just the people of Homestead, Florida, but everyone who'd been following the story of the couple who vanished after their wedding in 1985. Detective Prom pressed forward, letting the silence in the room weigh heavy on Otis Dunhall. Otis remained hunched over the metal table in the small interrogation room, his knuckles white, his knees bouncing under him in nervous movements. His face glimmered with nervous sweat under the dim yellow light, a dramatic contrast to the confidence and power that seemed to surround Gregory Whitmore just across the corridor. The two suspects were close in physical proximity, yet worlds apart in influence and control. Prom tried a gentler approach first. Otis, we know you were there when Melissa and Brandon disappeared. We know you followed their movements. We know you were close enough to the scene to dispose of their car in the swamp. Otis remained silent, staring down at his hands. His knuckles seemed to tremble slightly. It's not all your fault, Otis. The detective's tone was firm but not threatening. We know you were young. We know you were under pressure. Guys, like you, without power, without money, you do things you regret because someone else pulls the strings. But now you have a chance to make it right. Tell us the whole story. Tell us what really happened that night in 1985. For a moment, it seemed Otis might break. His breath faltered, his knuckles tightened. But then something shifted in him, a deep fear, a loyalty, a thread tying him back to someone more powerful. He pressed his lips together and fell into silence once again. Meanwhile, across the corridor, Gregory remained composed. His years of confidence seemed to act as a wall between him and the authorities. His lawyers were already filing motions, arguing for his release on bond and challenging the admissibility of certain testimony. His phone calls made from the holding cell were brief, coded, and made under the supervision of a deputy, adding to the growing suspicion that this conspiracy went much farther than the disappearance of two young people. There were hints, phone messages from powerful people, transactions routed through offshore accounts, suggesting a network of influence that went all the way up into the upper circles of Florida's elite detective. Prom knew that dismantling this conspiracy would take more than physical evidence. It would take testimony from someone on the inside, someone willing to break their silence. Otis seemed the weak link. The question was, how much pressure, or how much compassion, would it take to make him talk? As the hours turned into days, the department started to pursue a different angle: phone and financial transactions from the period immediately following the disappearance. The investigative team pored over phone logs, bank deposits, and transactions made by companies tied to the Whitmore family. Small payments made from a business account seemed to match the amount Otis was allegedly offered to take the blame. There were also large deposits routed through offshore accounts, transactions that seemed to move a considerable amount of money in a very short period, possibly payoffs to keep certain people silent. Meanwhile, a new view into the conspiracy opened from a different side, from a young woman who had been a close friend of Melissa in the months before the disappearance. Rachel Harper was her name, a woman now in her 40s, living quietly in Georgia with her children. But back in 1985, Rachel and Melissa were inseparable. Rachel insisted from the start that something was not right about the marriage, about the pressure from the Whitmore family. She described phone calls from Melissa and the days leading up to the disappearance, calls filled with fear and doubt suggesting someone was threatening her, trying to control her choices. Detective Prom flew to Georgia to meet Rachel in person. She was nervous, unsure whether speaking up now after all these years would put her in danger. Nevertheless, Rachel handed over a small stack of letters, notes Melissa had secretly kept, describing strange messages, threatening phone calls, and a growing feeling that something was closing in on her. The letters seemed to reflect a woman who was trying to break free from a powerful grip but was unsure how to do it safely. This new perspective opened up a dramatic view into the conspiracy from a more human side, not just transactions and suspects, but the fear of a young woman who fell in love and tried to assert her independence. Rachel insisted that the marriage itself was a form of control, a way for the Whitmore family to absorb Melissa into their world and silence her doubts. And when Melissa tried to break away, the conspiracy fell into place. As the story unfolded, from these different angles, from Otis's nervous silence, from Rachel's testimony, from financial transactions and phone messages, a picture started to emerge. It seemed this was not a simple disappearance. It was a conspiracy designed to erase two people from view and control a narrative. The suspects were not acting impulsively. This was a careful, well-planned move by a powerful family trying to protect their future at all costs. Detective Prom pressed forward, adding piece after piece to a puzzle that seemed to grow more sinister with each new revelation. He questioned suspects, interviewed witnesses, and followed the trail of phone calls, payments, and messages back through the years. The conspiracy seemed to have many threads, financial, legal, and deeply personal, tying back to a man who believed his power made him untouchable. Meanwhile, Otis remained a key. His testimony could connect all these disparate elements into a clear story. If only he would break. His resolve was weakening, his confidence faltering, and the pressure was mounting. The detective knew that it was only a matter of time before something or someone made Otis talk. As the conspiracy came into sharper view, the human cost of it all seemed more dramatic and painful. At the center were two young people whose love challenged a rich and powerful man's control, and for that, their lives were erased, their future stolen. But the conspiracy was starting to crack. The suspects were feeling the pressure, the phone messages were tying back to key players, and the conspiracy itself was growing more fragile by the day, whatever the final showdown would bring. It seemed the truth was close enough to illuminate all the hidden motives, all the shame, and all the crimes that had kept this story buried for years. Detective Prom stood in the dimly lit observation room, staring through the two-way mirror into the small interrogation chamber where Otis Dunhull sat hunched over, hands knotted together, knuckles white. His silence was weakening, his confidence was slipping away, piece by piece, and the pressure was mounting. The conspiracy that had kept two people hidden for years was beginning to crack. Everyone knew it. The suspects, the lawyers, the journalists, all were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. In the adjacent room, Rachel Harper was going over her testimony with a young detective. She recounted the threatening phone calls Melissa received, the messages that seemed designed to control and intimidate her, and the growing fear in her friend's voice in the days before the disappearance. Rachel insisted Melissa hadn't run away. She'd gotten entangled in something much darker, something a rich and powerful man was willing to do whatever it took to keep hidden. Rachel pressed a stack of letters into the detective's hands. Letters Melissa had secretly kept, documents that seemed to connect directly back to the conspiracy and its suspects. Detective Prom turned away from the observation mirror and nodded. "Bring in the phone and financial reports." His team rushed forward with a thick file filled with phone messages, payments routed through offshore accounts, and transactions made in the days immediately following the disappearance. The paper trail seemed messy, confusing, but when put together it formed a clear path, a path back toward a man who believed power made him untouchable. Meanwhile, Otis remained a key piece in this puzzle. His hands trembled as the detectives pressed him, piece by piece, tying him to phone calls made from a phone booth near the park and payments made to him in large amounts shortly afterwards. The phone messages were brief instructions, not requests from someone in a position of power. The payments flowed through an account connected to the Whitmore businesses. It seemed more and more that Otis hadn't acted alone. He'd gotten orders from someone else, someone who believed their influence made it impossible for the truth to come out. Detective Prom pressed him once more. "Otis, we know you. We didn't do this by yourself. We know someone else was pulling the strings. Tell us now. It's the only way you can help yourself." Otis remained silent, but this time his silence seemed less sure, more unsure. The first crack in his resolve. Meanwhile, across town, a different scene was playing out. The forensics team had finished analyzing the yellow Thunderbird. Inside, they'd found something puzzling, a small piece of cloth, a button. Something that seemed to match the description of Melissa's clothing from the last day she was seen. It seemed that whatever had happened to her, it hadn't gone smoothly. There was a struggle. There were traces of a fight, a dramatic, desperate moment when two young people fought back against whatever was threatening them as this physical evidence fell into place. Alongside phone messages and financial transactions, the conspiracy seemed less hidden, more exposed. The suspects were feeling the pressure. The rich and powerful were nervous. The weak link Otis was close to breaking. Everyone involved knew a showdown was coming. The conspiracy, a puzzle made up of phone calls, payments, testimony, and physical clues, was about to come together in a dramatic, final moment. Detective Prom pressed forward, calling in additional resources, more officers to handle suspects, more forensics experts to process the growing pile of physical and digital evidence. His team prepared a warrant to search a storage unit believed to be tied directly to the conspiracy. Whatever was in it might be the key to tying all these disparate threads together, tying the conspiracy directly back to a powerful family. Meanwhile, journalists were camped outside the police department. Rumors were spreading through the community, and the suspects were growing more nervous by the hour. The rich man who had kept his power hidden for years was feeling it slipping through his hands. His grip was weakening. The conspiracy was unraveling. And soon the whole story, what really happened to Melissa and Brandon, would come into the light. As the tension rose, the suspects made phone calls, pressed their lawyers, tried to destroy documents, and called in favors. But the net was closing in. The conspiracy that seemed impenetrable was about to break, piece by piece, and when it fell, it would bring down not just the people directly involved, but everyone who tried to conceal the truth. The final showdown was close enough to taste, and when it came, it would shock everyone who thought this story was finished. Detective Prom pressed forward with a search of the storage unit. His team forced the lock and slid back the heavy metal door, letting a rush of stale air escape into the dimly lit corridor. Inside, neatly stacked against the back wall, were a few cardboard boxes labeled with initials. OW initials that seemed to match Otis Dunnell's at first. It seemed these were just paperwork, files, ordinary documents. But then, hidden at the bottom of a box labeled financial reports, beneath decades-old bank statements and real estate transactions, the detectives made a dramatic find. Inside a small leather pouch were photographs, Polaroids taken just days after Melissa and Brandon disappeared. The photos were blurred and shaky, but you could clearly make out two people bound and sitting side by side, fear visible in their eyes. It seemed the conspiracy hadn't meant for their deaths immediately. There were hours or days where the young couple were kept alive, powerless, and stranded, while their captors decided their fate. The photos fell from the pouch into Detective Prom's hands, adding a dramatic twist to a story already filled with suspicion and conspiracy. Suddenly, the timeline seemed to shift. It was no longer a simple killing, it was a kidnapping first. A period when the couple were alive and scared. A period when something else might have gone differently. Whatever happened during those hours seemed to be a key piece of the puzzle, a piece nobody previously knew existed. Prom rushed back toward the department with the photographs in hand. His pulse was quickening. This meant the conspiracy was more sinister and more deliberate than anyone suspected. There were questions now: who kept them alive, for how long, and what orders were given in those final hours. Meanwhile, Otis remained a nervous mess in his cell. His knuckles were raw from repeatedly wringing his hands. His confession seemed close. All it might take was a little more pressure. But now the story was not just about a killing, it was about a kidnapping first. A conspiracy that went much further, and a rich family that seemed to control everything. From the outset, Detective Prom decided it was time to confront Otis with the photographs. He entered the small, dimly lit room and tossed the pouch on the metal table in front of him. The Polaroids fell in a small stack. Otis glanced at them and turned away immediately, his face draining of color. "Where did you find these?" he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "That's not your main concern, Otis." The detective pressed forward. "Your main concern should be what you do now. The conspiracy you kept hidden for years is falling apart. We know this went further. We know there were orders from above. It's not just you. It's not just a rich man trying to erase a scandal. There were phone calls, payments, messages, and now we have photos proving this was a kidnapping first. Whatever you were going to say before, whatever story you were going to use to protect yourself, it's not enough. The conspiracy is bigger, and we're going to find everyone involved." Otis remained silent, but a tremor passed through him. His knuckles tightened against the table, and a bead of nervous sweat fell from his forehead. His silence was not confidence. It was fear. Fear for himself, for his future, and for those who were higher up in this conspiracy. As the detective beside him, a phone call came in. Something urgent. An officer opened the door and whispered to Prom. The phone call was from the state's attorney, someone higher up in the legal chain. There were rumors, credible rumors, that a key piece of testimony was about to disappear, a person who could connect all the suspects together. The conspiracy was closing in. But now there was a danger that someone might destroy a key piece of the puzzle to keep the conspiracy hidden forever. Detective Prom turned back to Otis. "We're running out of time. If you want to help yourself, now's the moment. Tell me what you know about the kidnapping, about who kept them alive, about the orders you received. If you stay silent much longer, it might be too late." Otis remained silent, battling his conscience and his fear, but deep down, everyone in the room knew a showdown was close, and when it came, it would be dramatic, dangerous, and explosive. As the conspiracy tightened its grip and the suspects tried to destroy the last traces of their crimes, the true story was about to come into view. The rich and powerful were feeling the pressure. The weak were turning against their masters, and the authorities were closing in. The conspiracy was alive, dangerous, and more sinister than anyone previously suspected, and soon the whole world would learn just how deep it went. Detective Prom pressed forward, his voice firm but calm. "Otis, this is your last chance. The conspiracy is falling apart. The rich and powerful can't protect you much longer. Whatever you know, we need it now." Otis remained silent for a moment, staring down at the Polaroids, the shaky images of Melissa and Brandon, bound and afraid, then sighed. His whole body seemed to tremble as years of secrecy came pouring out. It wasn't supposed to be this way. His voice was shaky, filled with regret. The plan was just to keep them for a while, let Gregory make his move, but things got messy. We were supposed to let them go once the marriage was annulled, once the scandal was gone, but then something went wrong. Someone crossed a line. Someone decided it was easier to get rid of them permanently. Otis paused, closing his eyes against the memory. It was Ray. It was the driver. He went further than we were told. He finished it without orders. Detective Prom pressed. Where are their remains, Otis? We need to bring them home. Otis nodded weakly. The cave, a small cave near the trail where you first followed us. That's where Ray put their bodies, under a pile of stones. At this confession, officers rushed to the scene. The cave was small, nearly hidden by vegetation, a place few would venture without a guide. There, under a stack of heavy stones, the two were finally recovered side by side, hands nearly touching, united in death just as they were in life. The state's attorney acted quickly. Ray was taken into custody and questioned immediately. His confession filled in the final gaps, how he'd gotten the order from someone close to the Whitmore family, how fear and loyalty kept him from speaking up all these years, and how, in a moment of cowardice, under pressure, he chose to dispose of the couple instead of letting them go. The conspiracy fell, piece by piece. The rich and powerful were exposed. Their motives were driven by control, shame, and a fear of scandal as the suspects were led away in handcuffs. Linda stood quietly at the cave's entrance, letting the silence sink in. Her daughter and son-in-law were gone, but the truth was no longer hidden. The conspiracy had come to light. The suspects were in custody, the bodies were recovered, and justice was within reach. The years of suspicion, rumors, and doubts were not in vain. A mother's love and persistence had made sure the truth came forward. But just when everyone thought the story was finished, there was a final twist, something nobody expected. Among the effects recovered from the cave were a small leather pouch and a piece of paper. Inside it were documents tying a secondary person, someone close to the family, someone nobody suspected, to the conspiracy. The initials were clear, the transactions were documented, and messages were exchanged. It seemed this person had kept a low profile, letting everyone else take the blame while they remained safely in the background. The conspiracy was more deep-rooted than anyone believed, and the suspects were not all in custody just yet. As the detectives pressed forward with their investigations, this last piece of evidence opened a new path, a path toward someone who seemed to be the mastermind, the hidden actor who orchestrated much of what unfolded. The conspiracy might be falling, but its greatest twist was yet to come. The rich, the powerful, and the hidden were about to be exposed, and the true story was far from over. Detective Prom pressed the piece of paper against the light in his office, trying to make sure he was seeing it right. The initials were clear, the transactions were documented, and messages were exchanged. All this seemed to connect back to someone nobody suspected, someone close enough to the conspiracy to know all the details, yet distant enough from suspicion to avoid the initial investigations. The initials were D.W. Daniel Whitmore. At first, this seemed impossible. Daniel had been helpful, cooperative, a son trying to do the right thing. But now, doubts were creeping in. Had Daniel played a role all this time? Prom called in a small team and quietly opened a new inquiry. His first move was to bring in financial experts to follow the transactions labeled with D.W. The trail seemed to lead back to a set of payments routed through offshore accounts, payments made after the disappearance, suggesting that someone close to the family was rewarded for their silence or participation. The transactions fell into place. There were messages tying these payments directly back to a phone in Daniel's name. As the true conspiracy unfolded, a painful picture started to emerge. It seemed that Daniel hadn't gotten a large payout immediately. Instead, it came in small amounts over years, meant to keep him comfortable and silent. His motives were more complex than pure malice. There were messages suggesting regret, shame, and fear. He hadn't meant for it to spiral this far, but once it did, there seemed to be no turning back. Detective Prom made the tough decision to bring Daniel in for questioning. It was a dramatic moment, a son taken into custody under suspicion of conspiracy, a rich family further divided by suspicion and tragedy. The officers asked him about transactions, messages, and phone calls made in the years following the disappearance. At first, Daniel insisted it was all a misunderstanding. He said the payments were related to a legitimate trust fund, but the messages made it clear this was a lie. The transactions were a form of hush money, a price for staying silent while the conspiracy remained hidden. Faced with the growing pile of evidence, and the knowledge that the conspiracy was falling in on itself, Daniel broke down. His confession was painful and messy. He explained how, when his brother fell in love with Melissa against their father's wishes, there were heated arguments and pressure from the family to make it disappear. At first it was meant to be a temporary solution, a way to separate the couple and send Melissa away. But then the plan fell into the hands of people less careful, less principled. His own cowardice kept him from speaking up when things went awry. His silence made him a participant, a keeper of a terrible secret. As the confession came to light, the conspiracy that had kept this story hidden for years was fully exposed. The rich and powerful, the weak and vulnerable, all were tied into a dramatic, painful story of control, regret, and tragedy. The suspects were in custody, the conspiracy dismantled, and the families were left to piece their lives back together in the wake of the revelations. Linda stood quietly in the police department's conference room when Detective Prom finished. reading the confession aloud. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from a deep mixture of relief and sadness. She hadn't gotten back what was taken from her, her daughter, her future. But now the conspiracy was exposed, and the people responsible were going to face justice. There was peace in that, a peace she hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, the authorities made sure the conspiracy was thoroughly documented. The transactions, messages, phone calls, and physical evidence were all preserved. The suspects were put on trial: Gregory, Otis, Ray, and now Daniel, and a jury listened carefully to the testimony, piece by piece. The trial was a dramatic showdown, a rich, powerful family forced to answer for a conspiracy that stole 2 young lives and kept the truth hidden for years. The jury convicted all involved. The conspiracy fell, and justice was served. The rich were not above the law, the powerful were not untouchable. The conspiracy, for all its careful planning and secrecy, fell under the weight of a single key. The key labeled deed, a small piece of evidence that opened a path to the hidden truth. In the years that followed, Linda made sure Melissa and Brandon were properly memorialized. A small plaque was placed near the cave in the park, a spot where tourists and locals alike could reflect on their story. It became a place not just of tragedy, but of peace, a symbol of love, perseverance, and justice. The yellow Thunderbird, the Polaroids, the transactions, all were preserved in police files and court documents, a permanent record of a conspiracy that fell under its own weight. Detective Prom remained a key figure in the story, a man who followed the trail to the very end, not resting until the conspiracy was exposed and the suspects were held accountable. His years of service were recognized by the department, and many in the community called him a hero. But when journalists asked him if it felt like a triumph, he shook his head. "It feels more like a tragedy we could have avoided if people hadn't let their greed and cowardice destroy 2 young lives." Linda remained a strong, brave woman in the face of unimaginable tragedy. She kept her daughter's memory alive through a small foundation that supported education and community programs in her name. The yellow Thunderbird was gone, the suspects were convicted, but the love between Melissa and Brandon remained, a permanent thread tying their stories together, a thread that not even conspiracy or tragedy could cut. As the years went by, the conspiracy of 1985 fell into the past, a dramatic story that reminded everyone how much damage secrecy and cowardice can do. But it also stood as a powerful example of a mother's love, a detective's persistence, and a community's ability to seek the truth, no matter how much was hidden. And in the end, when all was said and done, it was love and justice that remained, a peace made from tragedy, a light in the darkest of nights, a legacy that not even conspiracy could erase.